Hello and welcome to the Thursday, November 20th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu undergraduate certificate program in Applied Cybersecurity. Today's diary was inspired by the classworm malware that we had a couple of weeks ago. This was this set of Visual Studio Code extensions that injected malware, and the malware was sort of invisible because it used these Unicode variance selectors, which is one of those features that people aren't really aware of that it even exists in Unicode. And with that, I wanted to summarize some of these sort of often overlooked security issues when it comes to Unicode. People usually focus more on things like lookalike domain names, which personally I actually don't really consider such a big deal. Many browsers, like in particular Chrome, is pretty good about not displaying many of these domain names. But instead, we also have the same issue in applications. We do have some character conversions that can cause issues like cross-site scripting and SQL injection. And then, variance selectors that may appear to display a different text than is then actually being interpreted by your system. Same with left to right versus right to left text directions that can also cause issues with visual code reviews. So just want to summarize this quickly. There isn't really that much to it, but if you have any other ideas about important things with Unicode, let me know. I'm thinking about doing at least one more follow-up on this with regular expressions and Unicode, because that's another issue. And I think another problem with Unicode is it suffers a little bit from the same problem as IPv6, that people kind of ignore it. They don't really think they're using it, but everybody uses it in some form. If you have a web application that does use UTF-8 encoding, which is pretty much any web application, you're probably open to Unicode attacks in some form. And then apologies, the next story should have made it into yesterday's podcast, just missed it. This is yet another FortiWeb issue. Fortinet did publish an advisory stating that there is a second vulnerability that they recently patched but hadn't disclosed yet. Well, they're now coming clear. After all, it's already being exploited in the wild. And kind of tells you that delaying disclosure of these vulnerabilities does not necessarily delay exploitation of the vulnerabilities, in particular if they're easy to exploit. Now, this one has a lower CVSS score of 6.7, so it's only medium, in part because it does require authentication, so there is some barrier to actually exploiting this arbitrary code execution vulnerability. But well, let's flip to some of the consumer devices. And here we have, first of all, DLink announcing 4 different vulnerabilities in their DIR-87 routers. This is a very popular model, but sadly, it's out of support. So you won't see any patches for these vulnerabilities. If you want to keep the hardware alive, your best option is, and I'm not even sure if that's an option for this particular model, but to install something like OpenWRT or such, that may be an option here. Other than that, toss the device, buy a different one. That's how you want to patch this. So it's usually the upgrade via the trash bin. And Security Scorecard came out with a report documenting an operation that they're calling WrtHug. This particular attack was directed at ASUS routers. It did not use any new vulnerabilities. Instead, older ones from 2023 were mostly being used here in this particular set of attacks. What's also interesting is, and I mentioned this yesterday when we talked about the malware that we actually had a diary about yesterday, that this also had as a goal to set up a relay network. So infrastructure for follow-up attacks. Also, Security Scorecard, it's a company that sort of, scans the internet for sort of attack surface measurements and such. They were able to actually measure the size of this particular botnet because the attacker here did install a very specific certificate on these routers, and they estimate about 50,000 routers were affected by this attack. Well, just a couple words here about all of the attacks we talked about here, the FortiWeb, the DLink, the ASUS attack. They all have one thing in common, and that's that there is actually a reasonable, easy way to mitigate many of these issues, and that's just separating your control plane. So what this refers to is make sure that you limit access to your admin interfaces and APIs. So make sure they're only accessible from trusted networks like an admin VLAN or a VPN, or at least in a home setup from your internal network and not exposed to the outside world. With that configuration setting, you can pretty much prevent like 90% or so of these attacks. And it's usually the default setting, but sometimes for convenience or so, people are setting up remote access to these admin interfaces, like to do remote maintenance and the like. Well, if you need that, please use a VPN. Well, and that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Thanks for liking and subscribing to this podcast. As always, special thanks if you're leaving a comment with your favorite podcast platform. That's it for today, and talk to you again tomorrow. Bye.